So now let's take a look at summative assessment and some different types of summative assessment that we can work to design as teachers. Now, it's helpful to keep in mind the difference between formative assessment and summative assessment. The goal of formative assessment being to monitor students' learning and to provide ongoing feedback that we can use to improve our instruction and that our students can use to improve their learning. But right now we're talking about summative assessment, where our goal is to evaluate students' learning at the end of an instructional unit by comparing it against some sort of standard or benchmark. To illustrate this, let's look at this recent example. On the left, you see my son, and he and his friends got together recently and started up a band called Pickup Line, despite, my objections. And they've been playing in each other's garages and in each other's basements. Recently, however, Righteous Slice, the pizza place downtown, allowed them to play at their establishment on a Friday night. So one way to think about this is formative assessment is when we play in the garage, and summative assessment is when we step on stage in front of people. And it begs the question, when they actually play, how can we tell how good they really are, or bad they really are? Now, just to preface this, none of them are really accomplished singers or musicians just yet. So what you're about to see is just some clips from a few of their songs where they take turns each doing a song. But I want you to ask yourself, how good are they? And how can I tell? So think back to the original questions. Just how good or maybe bad are they, and how can we tell? When it comes to tasks like this, where we have to put multiple skills together in some sort of performance or process or product, it's difficult to determine in what areas are our students being successful. So in this case, we don't want to make just a judgment call overall. Well, they were great or they were really terrible. Instead, what would be more helpful would be to identify and evaluate this group in different areas. For example, maybe something like stage presence, or overall tone and quality of the music, or vocals, or their ability to stay balanced between each other, maybe the reaction of the crowd, or do we do something quantifiable like how many girls came up and talked to my son afterwards? This is the challenge of summative assessment, making sure that we can gauge to what degree individuals are successful or not. So if we think about backward design, in other words, the three major steps that we follow as educators as we develop and design learning experiences for our students, we see that the first step is to identify desired results. Teachers and students need to know clearly what are the big ideas and skills that we're working to attain. The next step becomes for us to determine acceptable evidence, or a culminating assessment task. That's why our learning objective is for us to be able to understand the differences between formative and summative applications of assessment and know how and when to use each. We also need to be able to balance the use of an effective range of formative and summative assessment strategies in order to support, verify, and document learning. So let's start by defining summative assessment. Summative assessment refers to tests, projects, performances, and other measurement instruments that take place at the end of instruction, the end of a unit, a grading period, or a course. Summative assessment is intended to, first, determine the extent of the student's achievement and competence, second, to provide a basis for us to assign grades, and third, to provide the data from which reports to families and transcripts can be prepared. Now, when we talk about summative assessment, we're typically examining a student's broad ability. This is in contrast to the detailed examination of each component that we look at in formative assessment. In other words, formative assessment looks very closely at a student's ability to know or be able to do a very small component, where summative assessment focuses on broader abilities and performances. Now, many times when we hear summative assessment, we think about multiple choice questions, such as these. And the truth is that summative assessment often will include multiple choice questions, but it also needs to include a blend of extended response items, technology-enhanced items, as well as performance tasks, so that students can demonstrate problem-solving and critical thinking in addition to the knowledge that they've retained. This blended approach to summative assessment is what we should seek to provide to our students. And these assessments can include any activity that provides an opportunity for students to demonstrate their learning or knowledge. And in addition to traditional items, or think multiple choice questions, there are various other types of summative assessment that we can utilize to gather evidence of learning from our students. One of these types is product assessments. In other words, assessments that result in tangible indicators of knowledge. They tend to resemble final products that would be produced in the real world, such as a 3D model in a drafting class, a short story, or literary analysis in an English literature class, or an interactive timeline of cause and effect relationships that are examined in a history class. Product assessments ask students to create a product. Another type of summative assessment is a performance assessment. These assessments involve teachers in directly observing the application of skills that have been taught or information. For example, a teacher observing a final speech in a public speaking class, or observing and evaluating a performance of a music ensemble or a theater troupe. We can also explore the use of process-focused assessments. These are assessments through which teachers can evaluate the process of learning as well as the outcome. For example, when a teacher has students show their work or think aloud as they answer questions, or when a teacher asks students to follow and show evidence that they followed the steps of the writing process, brainstorming, drafting, getting feedback, revising, editing, publishing. The emphasis is on evaluating the process of learning as well as the outcome. Often when we talk about summative assessment, we talk about two different types, norm-referenced and criterion-referenced summative assessment. Now, norm-referenced evaluation and assessment is used to interpret a score of an individual by comparing or ranking it with the scores of other individuals. For example, a teacher might use a norm-referenced test to compare the reading abilities of a student to his or her peers before determining initial reading groups at the beginning of a unit. Or on widely utilized reading and math assessments, we can see what percentile a student is in comparison with his or her peers. Let's say that we're worried about this student's reading ability. We might consider looking at a norm-referenced reading exam to determine what is the percentile that this student falls into. So let's say that we find that this student falls into the 20th percentile when compared with his or her peers. That means that out of 100 students, this student's abilities exceed that of 19 other students, but are behind 80 other students. Norm-referenced evaluations can provide valuable information by looking at an individual student's performance and then comparing it and ranking it with the scores of others. Now, in contrast, we have criterion-referenced evaluation. This is used to interpret an individual's performance by comparing it not to their peers, but to some specified criterion, such as a performance standard. Whether or not the individual can or cannot demonstrate mastery at a certain standard is the primary concern. How well the student performs in comparison with others is not considered. For example, in class, when we establish a criteria, we look closely at a student's work or performance and evaluate it based on the criteria or rubric that has been established. In addition, there are other types of assessment that don't fit as neatly into the categories of summative or formative assessment. For example, we have benchmark or what we call interim assessment. So this is when we evaluate and compare student understanding or performance against some sort of standard at different intervals throughout the school year. So we might take a student and every trimester do a quick reading or math assessment and use the same standard to evaluate that to track whether or not they're progressing or growing. Another form of assessment is diagnostic assessment. And this is a form of pre-assessment where we try to evaluate our students' specific strengths or weaknesses or knowledge and skills before we've even provided instruction. Sometimes teachers actually administer the same assessment later on, post-instruction, to identify whether or not students have met a course's required learning objectives. Yet another practice for assessment is the use of screening assessments. These are typically assessments that we give to all of our students to identify general ability. And it's usually the first step in determining a student's readiness for on-grade level instruction. For example, let's say a new student walks into our school 3 weeks after the school year has started. It's not uncommon for them to have immediately a screening exam or screening assessment in reading and math to determine about where they're at in each of those subjects. Then, based on their performance in that initial screener, we can begin identifying learners who might need a little extra help or alternative forms of instruction in order to make some progress. Screening assessments also help us determine if students are in need of further diagnosis. When it comes to summative assessment, other considerations are to make sure that we get maximum effort out of our students. So let's say, for example, we ask each student to put both of their feet together and then jump as far forward as they can. Then we measure that. If a student isn't giving maximum effort, we're really not able to accurately measure what their ability or capability is. However, when a student does his or her very best to jump as far as he or she can, we get a measurement of their actual performance. That's why it's important to design assessment tasks that engage and challenge students and encourage maximum effort, rather than allowing students to perceive assessment tasks as just one more hoop that I need to jump through. For this reason, it's important to balance both traditional and authentic assessment. Traditional assessments, such as multiple choice questions, do tend to reveal students' ability to respond to questions that are formulated by the teacher. But when we provide our students authentic assessment tasks, or opportunities to solve challenges that exist in the real world, we are requiring our students to be effective performers with acquired knowledge. Traditional assessments tend to present students with focused opportunities to recall, summarize, or apply what was learned. But authentic real-world assessment can present the student with tasks that mirror the priorities and challenges in the real world, such as formulating and defending solutions to real-world problems, conducting research, writing, revising, and discussing papers, or working to provide an engaging oral analysis of a recent political event. Traditional assessments typically ask students to select or write the correct response, but rarely do these types of assessments allow adequate opportunity to plan, revise, and substantiate a response, even when students are given open-ended questions. Authentic assessments, on the other hand, encourage students to craft, polish, and justify their answers, or performances and products. Another difference is that traditional assessments tend to be clearly structured, with different concepts or skills that are being assessed, each with multiple questions for each knowledge piece or skill. In contrast, authentic assessment tasks frequently involve ill-structured challenges and roles that help students rehearse for the complex ambiguities of the game of adult and professional life. It's not a question of which one is better, but rather a question of how do we utilize both effectively. We do this by identifying which type of assessment, be it traditional response, open-ended, a product, performance, or process assessment, will allow us to collect the best and most accurate evidence of student learning, and then blend those together in a meaningful, challenging assessment for each of our students.